Is Lucky Day Pete McTighe's best episode of Doctor Who so far? Okay, so before watching this episode, I was cautious because I've not been the biggest fan of Pete McTighe or Pete McTighe's previous episodes of Doctor Who. Kablam, from what I remember, was okay for the most part, but has a very terrible ending.
The systems aren't the problem. How people use and exploit the system, that's the problem.
That I'm really not a fan of and kind of sours the episode for me as a whole. And Praxeus, I genuinely just don't remember a thing about it, so I think that kind of says a lot about the episode itself. But I haven't rewatched those episodes in a long time, so maybe my thoughts would change on them if I watched them now. Probably not with Kablam, but maybe with Praxeus. But with those being my thoughts on Pete McTighe's previous episodes, what did I think of Lucky Day, and is it Pete McTighe's best episode of Doctor Who so far? Before we get into that review, I just want to mention, in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2 airing, I currently have a discount on my Patreon for 50% off your first month of any paid tier on my Patreon page when you use code SEASON2. So I'll make sure to have the Patreon linked in the description down below, but that's just a little discount I'm running in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2. And without further ado, let's get back into the review. So to begin with, it's good that even though this episode is a bit of a detour from the main story of this season, we still start with the Doctor and Belinda trying to land in May 2025 and getting a reading on the Vindicator in a way that also feeds into the main plot of this episode. So even though this episode is a bit of a detour, it still works in a more serialized approach that this season is going for, especially with Conrad likely returning in the finale as well. I've seen a lot of people compare this episode to Love and Monsters from Series 2, even calling this Love and Monsters 2. And while I was getting that vibe from the start of this episode, it really is only the first sort of 15 minutes or so of this episode that is giving that vibe. The rest of this episode isn't really anything like Love and Monsters, besides it being a Dr. Light story. We obviously get a flashback to an adventure with the Doctor and Ruby from Season 1. I had initially thought that this moment was maybe going to have an Autons cameo, thanks to the promotional images being released with the shop window dummies in the background, the filming location being the same as Henrik's from Rose, and me thinking that the antidote that the Doctor was holding could potentially be anti-plastic. But the closer we got to this episode, the more I realised that probably wasn't going to be the case, especially once we got the Next Time trailer for this episode. However, I believe the director of this episode, Peter Hall, or maybe it was Pete McTighe himself, I can't remember, did confirm in Unleashed that this was an intentional nod to the episode Rose, even if the Autons themselves didn't return. So it's nice that on the 20th anniversary of Doctor Who returning, the revival of Doctor Who, we did get a little nod to the first ever episode in this year's season, even if it wasn't the Autons themselves returning. But seeing those shop window dummies in the background did really make me want to see the Autons look like that if they returned in the future. And we also got confirmation that this happened immediately after the Devil's Cord, and weirdly not in that 6-month time jump we got between Space Babies and the Devil's Cord last year, which is where I expected this to be. Although I liked Ruby last year, I think since we've had Belinda this season, I've kind of realised how uninteresting she was as a companion last year. The Doctor and Ruby were just friends going on different adventures with no conflict or character development, as it happens off-screen in that 6-month time jump. Whereas Belinda and the Doctor have a lot more conflict this season, with Belinda wanting to get home and not necessarily trusting the Doctor, and the Doctor just wanting to go on adventures with her and assuming she'll want to come along for the ride. But with all that being said, I think Ruby was great in this episode. It's more interesting to see her on her own dealing with the aftermath of travelling with the Doctor, rather than just seeing her travelling with the Doctor as best friends. I'm also glad we got to see the return of the Sundays in this episode, including Ruby's birth mother Louise Miller, and especially Cherry Sunday, who is always the highlight of any episode that she's in, and I particularly enjoyed her moments in this episode. And obviously a big part of this episode is Ruby's new relationship with Conrad Clark, who she met on his podcast Lucky Day. I also really liked the scene where Ruby was explaining the Shriek to Conrad when they were in the cafe together, where we get a glimpse of what it would look like when Ruby is telling this story about what the Shriek does. I'm not sure whether this was in the script, it probably was, but if not, I want to give props to the director Peter Hall. Either way, even if this wasn't part of the script or was his idea, because either way it was directed phenomenally and was a great moment in this episode. But unsurprisingly, to me at least, Conrad isn't who he seems, and was actually just getting close to Ruby for his own gain. That's not to say the twist didn't work work for me, but I definitely knew he wasn't to be trusted from the start of this episode. And I think a lot of people have been slightly misunderstanding this character a little bit. I've seen a lot of people wondering how, after all the stuff that he's seen from the Shriek, the Doctor and Ruby, evidence of the Doctor being able to time travel as a child, with all that evidence, how he still doesn't seem to believe any of this is real. And that's kind of the point. He knows this stuff is real. He's seen it. He's just lying. Like the right-wing grifters and even politicians that I assume this character is meant to be based on, they know the stuff they're saying isn't true, but they're saying it to further their own agenda or line their pockets. Conrad knows aliens, the Doctor, the work at UNIT is all real, but he has an agenda to push and money to make. He's doing this just as a grift to make money. And this is made even more clear when he belittles Shirley, saying that she's living off benefits and saying that UNIT are wasting taxpayer money when he himself is proven to be dodging paying tax. And like he says to the Doctor at the end of this episode, I don't accept your reality, I reject it. Something that you'd hear a lot of right-wing grifters saying when they're told what they're saying is untrue, but they already know that and can't refute it, so all they can do is say that they don't accept the reality of the situation. So that's my personal view on Conrad in this episode. He knows all this stuff is true and the stuff that he's saying are all lies, but he doesn't care. That's just what he's doing. He's spreading misinformation so that he can make money because he's a grifter. Obviously, this episode ends with Conrad breaking into UNIT and holding them at gunpoint, trying to force them to admit that none of this is real. And he does this by using an inside man at UNIT, which I'd very quickly clocked on to being Jordan Lang, the new UNIT analyst, as he was introduced in this episode and was seen listening to the podcast at the start of the episode. It could have maybe been cool if they somehow introduced him earlier on so it wasn't as obvious that he was the inside man, but they probably didn't have all this fully ready when they were filming season 1, so they probably couldn't have put him in there. And this was the first time we'd seen UNIT in season 2, so there wasn't really any opportunity to do that, I guess. But it still could have been cool if there was some way they could have introduced this character earlier on to make it less obvious that he was going to be the inside man later on. And of course, Conrad shoots Jordan to get into UNIT, and when Kate points this out to Conrad and his audience, he once again lies, claiming that maybe UNIT shot him, or maybe he's an actor, when he obviously knows this isn't true, which is backing up what I was saying about Conrad earlier on. We of course also get a lot more of Kate Stewart in this particular episode, and although I've always liked Kate Stewart as a character, probably mostly due to Gemma Redgrave's performance, she's never really felt like much of a character in the past, and I think she's gradually been improving since she was reintroduced in the RTD2 era, but I think this episode is probably the best showing of Kate Stewart in Doctor Who that we've had so far. As satisfying as it is to see the Shriek set free on Conrad, and as obvious as it was that it was coming given that he hadn't taken the antidote, did Kate Stewart maybe go a little bit too far with this choice? Yeah, she definitely did, but from what Pete McTighe has said about this moment in the behind the scenes,
and it's the beginning of a story that has repercussions beyond this episode, beyond this season, even beyond this show.
This is something that's going to be addressed in the future and is likely going to feed into the spin-off he is co-writing with Russell, The War Between the Land and the Sea, so it'll be interesting to see that in the future. And backing up what I was saying about Conrad earlier on, even though he is almost killed by the Shriek at the end of this episode, he still says at least your special effects have improved when he knows he's safe. And this isn't because even after seeing the real Shriek and almost being killed by it, he still doesn't believe that it's real. It's because he knows the cameras are still on him, and all of this is being live streamed to his audience. Conrad knows the Shriek are real, he knows UNIT are real. He was genuinely scared for his life when the Shriek was about to eat him, and genuinely thankful that Ruby saved him. But that wouldn't fit his agenda he's been trying to get across this whole time, so once he thinks he's safe after the Shriek has been tased, and he realises the cameras are still on him, he has to keep playing up to them for his audience. At least, once again, that's just my interpretation of this anyway, and of Conrad's character in this episode. I know as well a lot of people have issues with how the public does a full 180 after the live stream and the incident at UNIT, where the public basically is once again in full support of UNIT and doesn't support Conrad anymore because it doesn't seem very realistic, and with what Conrad's supporters are probably like, they would still probably support him even if his lies have been exposed to the public and shown to be untrue. And while I agree with this, and it is a little bit weird that the public does a 180 and supports UNIT again, with Conrad likely returning for the the finale, I do think we are going to see more of this developed and shown during the finale, where we're probably going to see that Conrad does still have some supporters out there and are going to play a big part in the finale, in my opinion. That's just my speculation on what could happen with Conrad returning in the finale, if that does happen, which I think it will. And of course, this episode also ends with a confrontation between the Doctor and Conrad, with the Doctor giving Conrad a good talking to at the end of this episode. And I love this scene so much because I love how we get to see more of this darker side of Ncuti's Doctor. And I also love the lighting in this scene. I wish we saw the TARDIS lit like this more often instead of the boring white lighting that we get most of the time we see the TARDIS interior in this season and last season. And I also doubt that Pete McTighe and Russell T Davies realised how relevant some of these lines in this scene would be to this exact week that the episode aired in, because a lot of these lines just hit so hard in this particular week, which must have been a coincidence with how early this was filmed and written. And of course, like always, we get a Mrs. Flood cameo to end this episode. This for me personally is one of the better Mrs. Flood cameos this season, because it feels like it's actually further in the plot by her setting Conrad free, assumedly for the finale, unlike last week where she just showed up because she has to show up every week. But I do hate that this keeps happening at the end of every episode, because it's becoming very predictable and feels very tacked on to each episode. Because as soon as you get to the end of the episode and you see someone like in a silhouette, or you see their feet walking towards Conrad in this case, or you see the back of someone's head or something like that, you are immediately like, oh well, it's going to be Mrs. Flood, isn't it? Because we know she's got to show up in every episode. So like I said, because of that, it is just becoming very predictable and feels very tacked on to the end of each of these episodes, and would maybe feel a bit better if she just randomly showed up like in the middle of an episode or something like that, kind of like she did with the Robot Revolution. Even though that was obviously the start of the episode, it at least felt different to her showing up in literally like the last 2 minutes of the episode every time. Now, Russell has indicated that episode 6 is one of the episodes that we need to watch straight away without having it spoiled for us, and so I'm assuming and hoping that that is when we'll find out who Mrs. Flood is at the end of that episode, because if not, it's gonna get very frustrating just seeing her show up at the end of every episode and not really doing anything besides showing up for a cameo in the last couple of minutes. So I'm hoping that it is the end of episode 6 that we find out who she is, because if we have to wait for the end of the first part of the finale or at some point in the very last episode, it's going to be very frustrating just seeing her for a couple of minutes just for a cameo. But I'm assuming that's the case. I feel like the end of episode 6, the Doctor's going to notice her and he's going to be kind of wondering how she's at this Interstellar Song Contest in the future in outer space, and that's for some reason going to lead her to reveal who she is to the Doctor and set up the finale. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Overall, I quite like this episode, and although it isn't my favourite of the season so far, it's definitely better than the Robot Revolution, and I think we're currently 4 for 4 with the episodes being good this season. The only thing I'm worried about this season is the finale not sticking the landing again, and like I've said in the past, next week's episode, The Story in the Engine, is my most anticipated episode for this season, so I'm hoping I'm not going in with too high expectations for this one. And before I end this video, to answer the question from the beginning of this video, is this Pete McTighe's best episode of Doctor Who so far? Well, to say I wasn't a big fan of his previous 2 episodes, with one of them being an episode I really despise, mostly for its ending, and the other one just being very forgettable for me, I'd say for me, at least right now, this has to be his best episode he's written so far, but I'll probably rewatch his previous 2 episodes at some point in the near future so I can review them once this series is done, and I am excited for his work on The War Between the Land and the Sea, if it's going to continue some of the threads from this episode like it seems like it will. So with all that being said, let me know what you thought about this episode in the comments down below, and are you as excited as me for next week's episode? And before this video ends, I'd just like to give a shout out to my patrons JB, Tom Baker, Lewis, Andy Collin, flippredd, theunquest, James Box, Oliver Underwood, TheBeastBoss, and LukeN.B.N. These are all free members who, along with getting their names read out here, also get some behind the scenes updates such as thumbnail previews and a free monthly newsletter. To get your name read out at the start of videos, as well as getting early access to videos and exclusive content, you can join as a paid member. And in celebration of Doctor Who Season 2, I'm currently running a 50% discount off your first month on any tier if you use code SEASON2. I'll make sure to have my Patreon linked in the description down below. So subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.